He lost $100 million in a single trade at age 31, thought his career was over, then used that failure to rewrite global finance. The fall taught him one rule: control the risk, control the system. Decades later, he runs the system. So how did one mistake turn into the foundation of Wall Street's biggest empire? Every empire begins with a story of failure. In this one, a single trade gone wrong reshaped global finance forever. Larry Fink starts as a bond trader in the 1970s at First Boston. Young, ambitious, and brilliant with numbers, he helps invent the modern mortgage-backed security, a new way to turn home loans into tradable investments. For years, it worked beautifully. Then, in 1986, a single miscalculation wiped out $100 million. One mistake, one storm in the bond market. His career collapses. I'm Nate Ledger, and I've spent years tracing how money and power learn to move in silence. This story begins with a handshake that changed the world's economy forever. Most traders would have quit. Fink did something else. He studied every tick of that disaster. He realized Wall Street traded risk without measuring it. The entire system ran on luck, not logic. So in 1988, he founded BlackRock, a company built on the idea that risk could be controlled with data. He started with 8 partners and a belief: you can't manage money if you can't measure it. Well, by the mid-1990s, his obsession turns into a digital empire. He builds a program called Aladdin, short for Asset, Liability, and Debt, and Derivative Investment Network. It begins as a simple analytics tool, but grows into a system running thousands of servers across the globe. Today, it tracks over $21 trillion worth of assets. That's more than the GDP of China. Every move of the global market, bonds, stocks, mortgages, flows through this machine. Therefore, while Wall Street shouts about buying and selling, Aladdin quietly calculates who wins and who falls. The system runs stress tests on world economies daily. It even models how climate change could affect bond yields 50 years from now. Governments, banks, and even competitors rely on it. The irony? Aladdin's creator never sells a single share of the code. It's the most powerful black box in finance, and almost nobody outside BlackRock has seen inside it. But the story doesn't stop at machines or data, because once you control risk for everyone, you start controlling everyone's choices, and that's where the story of ownership begins. Control doesn't always come from owning everything. Sometimes it comes from owning enough of everything that matters. I've gone through the archives of Bretton Woods myself. The names, the deals, the signatures. What they built there was less a peace plan and more a blueprint for control. By the early 2000s, BlackRock had grown far beyond its data roots. It started small, managing pension funds and bonds, but it was building something bigger: ownership through simplicity. Fink's team began pushing index funds, investments that tracked the entire market instead of picking single stocks. Ordinary investors loved them because they were cheaper and safer. Governments loved them because they were stable. But there was a hidden effect. All that money started flowing into the same few hands. Therefore, as trillions moved into index funds, BlackRock quietly became a silent partner in almost every major company on Earth. It now holds stakes in Apple, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, ExxonMobil, and JP Morgan Chase. In fact, together with Vanguard and State Street, these 3 firms control about $20 trillion, nearly 1/5 of all global corporate shares. When companies hold shareholder meetings, these giants vote on leadership, policies, and strategies. So even though they don't run the companies directly, they guide how those companies act. It's a new kind of power, influence without headlines. However, with that came questions no one could easily answer. Who decides how $1 trillion fund votes? Who makes sure those decisions align with millions of small investors whose money fills those funds? Critics began calling it common ownership capitalism. It sounded efficient, but it also blurred lines between competition and coordination. Fink often spoke about responsibility. In 2018, his annual letter to CEOs said, Companies must serve a social purpose. It sparked praise and fear at the same time. Some called him a visionary. Others saw it as corporate power turning moral for convenience. By 2024, BlackRock's total assets reached over $10 trillion, larger than the GDP of every nation except the US and China. So while most people think of Wall Street as traders shouting over screens, the real power today sits quietly in the hands of a man who learned control by losing it once. And this control doesn't end in boardrooms, because soon it starts reaching presidents. Power that begins with money always finds its way into politics. Therefore, once BlackRock built the system that managed global wealth, the next step was clear. It started managing governments. In 2008, the world faced the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Banks fell one by one, credit froze, and global markets lost $10 trillion in value within months. While Washington scrambled, one call changed everything. The U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve turned to Larry Fink's BlackRock. His team used the Aladdin system to help clean up Wall Street's toxic assets, the very securities that broke the system. It was a remarkable twist. A private company hired to manage the government's response to a crisis created by other private companies. Therefore, BlackRock became the doctor for a wounded financial system. The firm advised on the AIG bailout, the Bear Stearns rescue, and the purchase of $1.3 trillion in mortgage securities. That relationship never ended. When COVID hit in 2020, the Fed again hired BlackRock to run emergency bond buying programs worth $750 billion. The same firm advising the government was also buying bonds for its clients. Critics called it a revolving door of money. But there's more. Fink's influence reached global politics. European central banks, the Bank of Canada, and even the ECB sought BlackRock's advice on monetary strategy. By 2023, former BlackRock executives had held senior roles in the U.S. Treasury, the Bank of England, and the European Central Bank. However, Fink rarely appears in public debates. He prefers quiet corridors and private meetings. When asked about power, he once said, "We're fiduciaries, not politicians." But the reality is that when the world's most powerful governments need guidance, they call the same man, that level of access blurs the line between private management and public authority, and it leads to a question few dare to ask. When the same firm advises both sides of every crisis, who is really running the recovery? The answer lies in how data and ideology start replacing democracy itself. After 2010, Larry Fink's influence took a new shape. He stopped talking only about markets and started talking about values. Therefore, what began as finance slowly turned into philosophy, but a philosophy written in numbers. Every year, Fink sends a letter to the CEOs of the world's biggest companies. These letters are not casual advice. They move markets. In 2018, one of them shook the corporate world. He wrote that companies must serve society, not just shareholders. Within days, media outlets from London to New York called it a turning point. Business schools began calling it stakeholder capitalism. However, the idea had a deeper layer. Because when BlackRock says what responsible business means, thousands of companies change policies to match it. Pension funds, governments, and even school endowments depend on BlackRock's approval. By 2022, the firm voted on more than 170,000 boardroom decisions in 1 year alone. Critics warned this was moral power hidden inside financial power. Some said it allowed one company to decide global standards, from climate rules to gender equality goals. Supporters said it finally held corporations accountable. Both were right, in a way. Then came the push for ESG investing, environmental, social, and governance. BlackRock directed billions toward green companies and away from polluters. The numbers were stunning. In 5 years, ESG funds grew to over $30 trillion worldwide. But many asked if this was about saving the planet or about controlling which industries survive. Fink replied with calm confidence. "Climate risk is investment risk," he said. Yet behind those words lay a shift bigger than it looked. A private firm had turned social good into a business model, and governments followed. By 2024, countries began adjusting climate policies based on financial risk ratings set by the same institutions managing their debt. Therefore, the cycle was complete. Power now moved quietly between finance, politics, and purpose, all speaking the same language. But every empire that grows this large faces a question. Can one man's vision decide what progress means for everyone else? There is power in information, but there is control in prediction. Therefore, when Larry Fink built Aladdin, he didn't just create software, he built a global nervous system for money. Aladdin began in the late 1980s as a simple risk tool. Today, it analyzes over $21 trillion in assets, more than the entire GDP of the United States. Governments, pension funds, and even competitors like State Street and Deutsche Bank rely on it daily. Every trade, every bond, every shift in global prices runs through its servers. To put that in scale, Aladdin tracks the movements of more than 200 million financial positions across tens of thousands of portfolios. It can simulate how a war, a pandemic, or even a policy speech might shake markets. And the shocking part is that even regulators use the same system the private world depends on. However, with such precision comes quiet influence. If Aladdin predicts that oil will fall or that inflation will rise, entire nations adjust their budgets before it even happens. Therefore, a program built to serve clients slowly became something like a global weather system for money. Insiders say its data rooms look like NASA control centers. Endless monitors, live feeds, and AI-driven forecasts running 24 hours a day. Around 5,000 engineers and analysts maintain it, feeding information from stock exchanges, bond markets, and even satellite data tracking global supply chains. Fink often calls Aladdin our brain, but some see it as the real seat of modern economic power, a system that connects Wall Street, central banks, and even governments under one digital eye. During the 2008 crisis, it guided U.S. agencies in deciding which banks could survive. During the 2020 pandemic, it calculated liquidity for the Federal Reserve's rescue programs. So while most people talk about money as power, the truth is the algorithm already runs it. And when one company owns the system that understands risk better than any government, it quietly decides what the world calls safe. But the story doesn't stop with data, because soon that system starts shaping what freedom itself will mean in the digital age. Every empire used to build monuments, banks built skyscrapers, kings built palaces. Larry Fink built something invisible, influence that hides in plain sight. Therefore, while governments debated laws, BlackRock quietly rewrote how global capitalism works. By 2025, the firm managed over $10 trillion, an amount larger than the economies of Japan and Germany combined. But money was never its real product. What Fink sold was access to markets, to regulators, and to the future itself. Every central bank, from Washington to Frankfurt, now holds conversations that somehow loop back to BlackRock's recommendations. However, the empire does not move through orders or threats. It moves through data, meetings, and reports that shape what leaders believe is good policy. When the European Central Bank needed climate advice, it hired BlackRock. When the U.S. Treasury needed crisis management, it called BlackRock. And when smaller nations restructured their debt, the IMF used models built with, again, BlackRock input. Therefore, a system meant to serve the market began serving itself. The firm's reach spread into defense, energy, healthcare, and even education. Its investments influence what technology gets funded and which companies rise or vanish. A decision deep inside Aladdin's data center can ripple into real lives, factory jobs, home loans, retirement savings, everything. Fink describes his mission as long-term capitalism, a phrase that sounds harmless until you realize how much of the future it touches. Every time a government borrows, or a citizen invests, or a company expands, somewhere in that web cites BlackRock. But here's the question that never goes away. how much power can stay invisible before it becomes permanent? The answer might not lie in money anymore, because when influence is built through code, risk models, and quiet boardrooms, it stops needing permission. And so, the story ends where control begins, not with a crown or a vote, but with a network so vast that even Wall Street follows its lead. Thanks for watching. I'm Nate Ledger, and if you enjoy peeling back the hidden layers of global power, you're in the right place. Another story waits just ahead.